Hi, good evening YouTube. My name's Sean Connors and welcome back to Outsiders, and tonight I'm going to do a video response to a channel of sorts who's proposed a fantastic video in regard to his idea on how to change, if you like, the normal way that we DM and the normal process between DM and player. Now in front of us here, what you're going to see is he's highlighted the essential tasks normally that a GM will have to undertake. And this is the beginning of his video. So in essence, to recap here very quickly, he's describing the world environment. That's what the DM does. So he describes the world environment. He role plays all the NPCs of the game world. He runs all the combats and any other conflict resolution that needs to happen. The most essential part to it, of course, is that he has to role play the story of the NPCs and weaving the threads behind the scenes to advance the plot. His proposal is that the top three needn't actually be done by the GM. In fact, he goes on to propose that you can actually delegate these tasks to the players, which in theory sounds quite an interesting idea. Now I have through my years of experience done a number of things, and obviously there are a number of new systems that have come out that do touch on some of the things he's brought up. So for example, Warhammer 3rd edition does talk about descriptive combats in a lot more detail, so literally letting the players describe based on what they do, what happens, depending on the success or failure of the task, which I think is an interesting way to use combat, and I've started doing that quite a lot anyway in my game, so I think that part can definitely be done, but the GM still, of course, runs the combat. I don't think that it's necessarily a good move to hand over the reins completely to the players, but I do think he's onto something here. And we'll go on to take a look in a moment at some of the other aspects that exist and some of the reasons why he says that his idea, his theory, does hold water. Now, one of the first things he looks at is about one of the problems that can quickly occur. He uses this example from the book The Order of the Stick and Don't Split the Party, and obviously once the party splits up, how does the DM handle a situation like this as an example? And he does highlight many other very good uses of what he's already proposed in the previous slide that you saw. But he is right, of course. A split party is a tricky thing to deal with. But personally, some of my best games have come from a split party. And I enjoy the manoeuvring between the two groups and keeping everybody involved, personally. I don't think it would get any easier if I was to delegate out some of the tasks, because if the party was to split, how would the player know what to do to bring the players back in line? That's going to be a very tricky thing to do. However, what he does do is give an example of a situation that the DM's in red and the three players are in the other three colours, and about how, effectively what the DM would normally do. So, as you can see, as the slide moves on, and we're about to move into the next phase of the slide, you'll see all the areas in red the DM would normally do, all the NPCs, description of combat they would run, and only certain parts of it would the player in green actually be involved. Obviously, the two other players in the example he gives sit on the sidelines. However, I take on board the points that he raised in regards to keeping those players interested, but that's never really been an issue in my games. So I think that's about how you as a GM keep everybody on their toes round the table, and how every particular role that anybody makes is important. But I think the most valuable thing that came out about looking at these slides was the fact that he is right. There is definitely some mileage in allowing the players to take the narrative scene in certain situations which are unlikely, in my view, to derail your game. It's a valid thing to do and probably a fantastic tool to get people involved. However, you can't really expect, to be perfectly honest, the players to run combats. I think that's, in my view, a bit too much, because it's a tricky mix. The players would then have to know the stats and everything else, and I'm not really sure that's really going to work. And how would it feel if you were the player and you happen to kill off one of the players around the table? It's in some ways it's easier to accept it from the GM, because I myself roll all the dice open exactly for that reason, and that also throws up another problem that obviously by definition of this you would most likely have to keep the rolls open anyway, which I don't think is a bad thing, but for obvious reasons you would have to do that, unless of course you're proposing that the players have a screen and roll the dice behind it. And you see where this is going. That becomes a little bit more complicated and a bit difficult to do. But again, I do want to harken back to the point, this is an excellent video that does highlight some really interesting new ground, and I think a channel of sorts should be highly recommended for even suggesting this, because to be honest with you, I do think he's onto something. Bringing the topic back onto point here that the channel of sorts proposed, in front of us now we see what will happen if certain players take over the task of running this particular situation, and this is explained very well in his video. And you can see that all the players are involved at this point in the game. I do think, and the referee obviously taking a very small piece of the final NPC, the fence in this case, because it's a critical part to keep the story on track. But this doesn't obviously account for what if the players go off tangent. How does the player who's taking the scene react to that, and when does the DM step in? I have a group of players myself who are very experienced, would easily derail this, and it needs a very skillful hand to bring it online. So I think that the truth of the thing is that there is merit in what he suggests, but it depends on A, the system, and B, the players you have round the table. The next part deals with how to support the players in terms of running his idea, which effectively is lots of visual aids, lots of pictures. Picture paints 1,000 words, which I'm totally in support of. You know, how you can support them through the mood of the pictures, through various charts and improv aids. It gives a lot of examples of where these things can be found. Also some ideas behind skeleting out NPCs and an arrangement of different books that you could have in your back library, which I often do, again to support the NPCs. Now, I'll stop at this point and I want to dwell on this. He then goes on to explain about what the potential disadvantages are. A loss of control of the story, which I totally agree with, because you know, you've still got to basically control the overall plot of the game, irrespective of what the players do, and it is a tricky mix to get this right. So that's why I come back to the point. It depends on the players, awful lot, and the system to whether it'll help support the idea. You might have done it differently, is one of the things he said. But I don't necessarily, I agree with him, I don't necessarily say that that's necessarily a bad thing. It's just that if it derails the game, or the player does something so dramatic that it changes the course of the action, you know, they may never make the fence in his example because of the way it's been played out. And he then goes on to explain that your players might not make much out of it. They might provide stale location description and undimensional NPCs. Now, this is a very good point, because you as a GM probably became a GM because of the fact that that's one of the strengths that you have, the ability to tell a story, the ability to bring those NPCs to life. Your players may not have that and may not feel that that's something they want to contribute towards. So what happens if they decide themselves that they don't want to do certain parts, they don't want to run combats, etc. I think I should add in at this point as well that combats themselves in some of the more modern systems, and I always use my old favourite Pathfinder at this point, do take up quite a lot of time in terms of the game night. I think you're right in suggesting that, you know, most game nights are going to sort of be between 4 and 5 hours generally, which is probably about right really in today's marketplace. But if a combat is run by an experienced GM, the GM will know how to shorten, to pace it and everything else. Players certainly don't have that skill. And to expect the players to be able to do that and know all the nuances of the combat manoeuvres, my God, know all the feats inside out and everything else, could make combats either very vanilla, very flat, or very boring. And if a player does run a combat very well, he's almost penalising his own team. I'm not sure this is really going to hold much water with a lot of people. But I do think, as I say, there is a part to this that you could use. And I come back to the fact that players could use descriptions to describe what they've done in combat. A channel of sorts does provide quite a lot of useful and helpful information on how to get players to tell the story, certain props, visual aids, various things that you can use to do it. And I think that's great. And he also makes it clear, you know, particularly as we reach the end of the video, as we're coming towards the end, about, you know, the pitfalls of this idea. But I don't want to lose, I'm going to keep saying it, I don't want to lose sight of the fact there is definitely something in this that I think I could use. I mean, there's certainly a number of things I am using. So I do think he's onto something. And I think if this idea is fine-tuned a little bit more, I think it's going to be really relevant. And I say full credit to him for introducing it. You can see from this next slide that effectively what the players are doing is they're getting a lot more control in the game. There are a number of key advantages to this. Let's take a look at those. Certainly the player activity is up by an awful lot, I do agree, because everybody is going to be involved. Players will shape the story and contribute much more, which again, by definition of what he's proposing, is obviously true. And different narrators and NPCs make it more interesting for everyone, and he uses the great win phrase, "you've got to mix it up," which again, in essence, is true. But as I say, there are a number of pitfalls to this that need to be thought through quite carefully. But overall, as I said right back at the very beginning, as we move towards the final two parts to this, there is definitely something in this. The next bit explains in detail the biggest advantage. In a Channel of Sorts view, it cuts down on prep time for the GM. It certainly does. But the players, it might cut down on prep time, but I think you're going to find that the first few weeks of trying this out, games are going to get pretty heavily bogged down as players begin to try to find their feet. And I'm not sure to what cost that would cause most gaming groups. Only time will tell, and I think it's something that needs to be tried out. Obviously, he's been very fair here. As you can see from the feedback, is appreciated. All the cravats, I probably missed a bunch. Pitfalls to be avoided in other game situations where this might be applied. I'm going to end on the same thing I've applied all the way through. For me, to recap, it's going to be the following. I think that he has a tremendous idea here that has merit. I think you can hand over to the players a number of the narrative controls. I think you can get them to describe certain things. My personal take on description has always been fairly simple, though, to be honest. I do believe that you describe it very simply, you keep it pretty succinct, and the most important thing is the key detail is the only thing that really needs to be described. The player's mind's eye will do the rest for you, but I don't think it harms at all occasionally to leave a blank canvas and let the players paint the picture. I think it's a very powerful tool indeed. I do believe he's onto something. I don't think for 1 second that you can really run combat, because I don't think it's right and fair to hand those controls over to the players, but I do think there are certain parts the players can do to support the GM. So for example, I think the players can they could run the initiative for the GM. That's not a problem, and that takes away some of the problems, so they can keep the initiative track on order. They can also, you can have a rules lawyer guy, someone, if you've got a more advanced system or a complicated system, can just check a rule up if necessary at a crunch moment, again to save the GM some time. Those things create buy-in when players are sat round the table, and keep those players on their toes watching what's going on. Certainly there is other ways you could probably bring that in, and I'm sure other people will touch on those. But for my take, the biggest advantage is to be very descriptive in the combat. I think it's fantastic, and it's something we've been doing a lot recently, where people roll the dice, but even if they miss, they describe what happened, and if they hit, they describe what happens, and that's really nice and appropriate, and it's interesting, and I found that to be one of the biggest strengths of more recent games over the last 2 or 3 years. So I would say to the Channel of Sorts, I commend you, sir, for a fantastic video. I really believe it's an incredibly brilliant video with a lot of merit. I think it's something that you should try and go back and have a rethink about a few areas where you could really improve this idea, and then bring it back to us, because I do think you're onto something. So I say bravo to you. Thank you for taking the time to do the video, and I hope that the feedback I've given you has been of some constructive use. Thanks again for your time. I've been Sean Connors, this has been Outsiders. Till the next time, take care of yourselves and happy gaming.